Well, it's time for us to get started with our class. We will be back in 2 Samuel this week, picking up in chapter 13. We got started with the first few verses of chapter 13 last week. And I know the last couple of lessons, we kind of slowed down our pace a little bit because chapters 11 and 12 and 13, we have really some important material. And so we've moved a little bit slower through the text the last couple of weeks, and we're going to continue this week in chapter 13. We've seen where some of the consequences of David's sin that were promised have begun to materialize. And so that's what we see in chapter 13, what was specifically promised that would happen because of David's sin. The Lord said in chapter 12 and verse 11, "Behold, I'll raise up evil against you from your own household. I'll even take your wives before your eyes and give them to your companion." And so you've got kind of, because David has committed this great sin, God says there are going to be some consequences. The next verse or two says, yes, your sin has been forgiven, but because of what you've done, here's what's going to happen. Here's what some of the consequences are going to be. And we begin in chapter 13 to see those, and it gets pretty ugly for some things in David's household. We covered about the first 5 or 6 verses of chapter 13 last week. We'll kind of quickly review those so that we get the context of what's going on, and then we'll get into the rest of the text in just a moment. Before we get started, however, would you bow with me, and we will begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we love you so much, and we thank you for the time that we get to spend in your word this morning, Father. And as we continue to look this morning, Father, at the consequence of sin, Father, I pray that it would give us a motivation to say no when Satan tempts, Father, that we would strive more and more to follow more closely in the steps of Jesus, Father, to be what you've called us to be. Father, thank you for your word and for the time that we get to spend it this morning. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. 2 Samuel chapter 13, as I mentioned, the consequences of David's sin. If you remember, he in chapter 11, he committed the sin of adultery and then murder to try to cover that up. And then in chapter 12, he was confronted by Nathan the prophet, who told him, here's what you've done. The Lord was not at all pleased with what David had done. And David confessed his sin. He didn't try to hide from it, didn't try to justify it or blame someone else. And Nathan informed him, and the Lord has forgiven you. However, because you've given opportunity to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, here's what the consequences are going to be. Chapter 13, what we have already seen is David's son Amnon has a desire for Tamar to the point that he just makes himself sick, and he listens to some bad advice from his friend Jonadab. And if you remember, we talked about that last week. He had a bad reputation. He was a shrewd but an unprincipled man. He was willing to give advice, just be dishonest. Here's a way that you can get what you want. Just lay down and pretend to be sick and have David send her to you. And so he gives some very sinful advice, and Amnon is to the point that, well, he has made himself sick. He has allowed this temptation to roll around in his head enough. And you remember we talked about how temptation works out of James chapter 1, that each one is tempted when he's drawn away and enticed by his own lust. And he has allowed this lust, this desire to be in his mind, and he's thought about it and thought about it and thought about it to the point that he listens to this advice to just be dishonest. One thing we looked at, Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 20 says, "He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." Jonadab gave him sinful advice, and Amnon took it. It is of the utmost importance who we choose to spend time around, who we choose to listen to, because whoever influences us or whoever we listen to and who we spend time around, ultimately we become more like them. And so are we choosing to be around godly people, or are we choosing to be around those who would, well, give us the kind of sinful advice that Jonadab gave to Amnon? Well, and then we get to, so he is called in this Amnon has taken the advice. He's going to lay down and pretend to be sick so that Tamar will come to him. He asked David to send Tamar to him, and then we get to verse 7. This is where we pick up after last week, beginning in verse 7. David sent to the house for Tamar, saying, "Go now to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house. He was lying down, and she took dough and kneaded it and made cakes in his sight and baked the cakes. She took the pan and dished them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, "Have everyone go out from me." So everyone went out from him. And Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the bedroom that I may eat from your hand." So Tamar took the cakes that she had made and brought them into the bedroom for Amnon. She brought them to him to eat. He took hold of her and said, "Come lie with me." But she answered and said, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. As for me, where could I get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you'll be like one of the fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." However, he would not listen to her, since he was stronger than she, and he violated her and lay with her. And so we have the turmoil now in David's house. You remember it was said back in chapter 12, there's going to be violence, there's going to be David's family situation. Now there are things starting to fall apart in a really big way in the very next chapter. And so Amnon here, it tells us he sexually assaults Tamar. David, believing that Amnon is sick, sends for Tamar. So he has successfully made this case that he's sick and that he needs her to come and care for him. And when she fixed food, it was to serve for him. He wouldn't eat, and so we see what's happened there. But she took the food to go in. He grabbed hold of her and overpowered. She pleaded with him. Such a thing, and she has several different ways that she pleads with him, several very good logical points that she makes, trying to appeal to his reason, trying to appeal to what it's going to do to her reputation, what it's going to do to his reputation, what this is going to, how this would turn out. Such a thing is not done in Israel. It's against the laws and the morality of God's people. And so she just puts this out. This is not the kind of thing that's supposed to be done. This is absolutely immoral and wicked. This is not the kind of thing that God's people do. It's disgraceful and wicked. She mentions here the disgracefulness of it. It is a senseless act. She tries to appeal to his conscience and telling him that this is sinful. And then she mentions both of their reputations. What about me? This would bring reproach on me. And so it would harm her reputation. She would be disgraced for the rest of her life. And he would be regarded as a fool. This isn't going to help either one of us. There's nothing good that's going to come of this from anyone. But then there's also, you think about Amnon. He was David's firstborn. And so as we know later on, we find out Solomon's ultimately the one who becomes the next king. But at this point, Amnon's going to be regarded as the heir apparent. Who of God's people is going to want a man like this on the throne? And so as she's appealing to him, look at what this would do to your reputation. This is not just a small thing. Hey, people are going to think badly of you. This would have big implications for him. You'll be regarded as a fool in Israel. This is not the kind of person that takes the throne to rule God's people. And then she finally argues that doing it by force is unnecessary anyway. If you'll just speak to the king, she argues, he won't withhold me. In other words, there could be a marriage that would take place. Now, very possibly she's trying to buy time to get out, because if you go to look at, for instance, Leviticus chapter 18 and Leviticus chapter 20, this kind of marriage specifically was against the law. And so if you go to Leviticus 18 and verse 11, he says, "The nakedness of your father's wife's daughter born to your father, she is your sister. You shall not uncover her. There's multiple passages in Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20 and verse 17, Deuteronomy 27 and verse 22 that forbids relations in the situation that they're in. And so every piece of this, of what's going on in chapter 13, is wrong. And so there's no part of this that's okay. She's either, and in her reasoning saying the king won't withhold me from you, she's either trying to buy time in order to get away, or she's reasoning that even that would be better than what you're trying to do. But either way, she's trying to reason with him to get out of this situation where he is trying to assault her or trying to convince her right on the spot. But he wouldn't listen, and it says that he overpowered her. She's resisted both verbally and physically, but it says he was stronger. So he wouldn't listen to moral reasoning. He wouldn't listen to religious reasoning. He wouldn't listen to rational considerations. What's this going to do to their reputations? He has completely lost his senses as far as thinking about what's going on here, and is completely given over to, he's going to give into this temptation no matter what. And so we see the state that he's in. We see how terrible this has become. But then in what follows, verse 15 says, Then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred. For the hatred with which he hated her was greater with the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, Get up and go away. She said to him, No, because the wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you've done to me. Yet he would not listen to her, and he called his young man who attended him and said, Now throw this woman out of my presence and lock the door behind her. Now she had on a long sleeve garment, for in this manner the virgin daughters of the king dressed themselves in robes. Then his attendant took her out and locked the door behind her. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her long sleeve garment, which was on her, and he put her hand on her head and went away crying aloud as she went. And so now, after this is all said and done, he says, I don't want anything to do with her anymore. His immediate response shows that, well, what it says there at the beginning, it wasn't really so much love as it was lust. But the question comes up here. She's saying, don't send me away, don't send me away. You know, part of us in our logical reasoning would be thinking she might want to get as far away as she could. Why would she say, don't send me away? There's her shame, but there's also a matter of the law and what it had to say. I'm sorry, Denny?
Yeah, the law required that she be cared for.
The law required that she be cared for in such a situation. The law dictated that a man who had relations with a virgin not pledged to be married to another was obligated to marry her, to pay a financial penalty. This is in Exodus 22 as well as Deuteronomy 22. But when Amnon ordered Tamar to get up and get out of his house, his actions following his initial sin indicated that he didn't intend to follow the law in this matter either. And so there was the requirement in the law that if that kind of relation was had, that he would care for her. But he refused to do that then. And so he commits, so at every step of this, he does it wrong. Like I said, in chapter 13, there's really every piece of what we're reading in this account, he gets it wrong. And she regarded her being thrown out as even worse than him choosing to assault her because of what happened. It appears that she considered herself now to be, his responsibility to care for, and now he's abandoning her. He's throwing her out. He even had to tell the servant, throw her out. The servant pushed her out the door and locked it behind her, leaving her on her own to go away weeping. The following verses say that she ended up staying with Absalom, her brother. She was desolate, childless, and really humiliated. Um, but the idea is that she stayed with him as one who's been disgraced. Um, and then, of course, in the aftermath, it tells us David becomes very angry. And I think that's another one of those statements in the Bible that is something of an understatement. Very angry. Um, you can imagine in David's situation, he would be furious over what has happened and over this terrible thing that's happened. But then we see what Absalom does in his anger at Amnon. Verse 22, Absalom did not speak to Amnon either good or bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he'd violated his sister Tamar. It came about after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. And so this gives us something of a timeline that Absalom has been bearing this grudge. He's been angry. He's had this bitter hatred now for, it says, 2 full years. This is not just a small thing. Absalom is now taking care of Tamar. It tells us in those previous verses. It was a traumatic experience for the family, not just especially for Tamar, but for the rest of the family as well. David is angry. Absalom is harboring a hatred. And adding to the trauma, this has happened in a prominent family. This isn't just anyone, but it's the king's family, as well as I mentioned Amnon, who is David's firstborn, who would be, outside of anything changing the situation, who would be looked at as the heir to the throne. Denny?
Yes, although an heir to the throne, he still took away David's responsibility to solve the problem. The world was looking at the king to solve this issue because everyone knew it was against the law. And so when Absalom did what he did, then it took away the responsibility that David failed to meet because he couldn't.
Yeah, and we see Absalom, as you mentioned here, taking things into his own hands. And what follows, you see it setting up here. He's angry. He hates Amnon. And this time passes, and now he's inviting all of the king's sons. And so we pick up in verse 24, where Absalom is getting ready to take his revenge. It's been 2 full years. He invites all the king's sons to attend a sheep shearing. He invites all the king's servants, but he's going to David saying, I want the whole family to come to this event. Well, and David, he refused because, well, that'll be a big burden on you. And so then in verse 26, when David refuses for everybody to go, he says, well, then Absalom said, well, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. Well, I think David's he's kind of wondering what's going on with that. He says, well, why should he go? Because, of course, David is probably he's going to remember what's happened. He's going to know, at least to some extent, Absalom and Amnon don't really get along too well. Why should he go? But when Absalom urged him, he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. So David says, okay, all of my sons will go, including Amnon. And so the request comes without delay. And it appears he's trying to kind of give the appearance of innocence. If the king himself isn't going to come, well, send my brother Amnon. He's the heir apparent. Send someone important. Send my brother with me. And so after some urging, you got verse 27, David sends all of his sons. And then in verse 28, we find out what this is all about, what his plan is in trying to get Amnon away from Jerusalem, away from the king, and kind of out at this event. As Absalom commanded his servants, saying, see now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then put him to death. Do not fear. Have I not myself commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. And the servants of Absalom did to Amnon just as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. And so Absalom gives the servants this command. He takes responsibility unto himself. He's going to deal with Amnon. And he takes responsibility for the murder himself. Haven't I commanded you to do this? In other words, he's telling them, this is my idea. You're just the servant carrying it out. And so he's taking responsibility. Don't worry about going through with it. This is on me, is kind of the idea. And when this takes place, well, of course, everybody else gets up and flees. They get up and run. In verses 30 to 39, some reports are brought back to David. Absalom flees to Geshur for 3 years, but the reports get brought back to David. And the first report that comes back to David was that Absalom has risen up and he's killed all of the king's sons. And so there's some devastation from David as he hears this. And you can imagine when he gets this report that Nathan's words from chapter 12 and verse 10 are ringing in his ears. Therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you've despised me and taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thinking about the consequence of David's own sin and now seeing violence happening in his family, the sword will not depart from your house. And he gets this report that his son Absalom has killed all the rest of his sons. I can't imagine news that could be as devastating as that. But then you remember who gave Amnon the advice to begin with. You got Jonadab. He's got some wisdom about him, but he's very unprincipled. He's just fine with giving the wrong kind of advice. But he's got a little bit of inside information as all of this is going on, so he comes back on the scene. And he's there with David. In verses 32 and 33, he kind of cleared things up. Jonadab, the son of Shemiah, David's brother, responded, "Don't let my lord suppose they've put to death all the young men of the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead, because by the intent of Absalom it has been determined since the day that he violated his sister Tamar. Now therefore do not let my lord the king take the report to heart, namely that all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead." So Jonadab here, he's had inside information apparently this whole time as to what's going on. And he comes in and is trying to comfort the king. Oh, it's just one of them. By the intent, he says in verse 32 of Absalom, this had been determined. There's been a grudge since that time. It said before, for 2 full years. It tells us Jonadab has known what's been going on for this 2 full years. Kind of makes you wonder, why didn't Jonadab come in a little bit earlier than this and say, oh, David, you might not want to let Amnon go out to this. But every time you see Jonadab come on the scene, you see he's kind of foolish in some ways, very unprincipled. But the rest of David's sons returned to Jerusalem. They all wept over what's happened. Whenever all of the news finally comes out and everybody's brought up to speed on specifically what's happened, and it tells us again, Absalom fled for 3 years to Geshur. And so there's the weeping, and then so Absalom now is kind of living as an exile, and that's where we get to chapter 14, where there's the pressure to bring him back. Because, of course, if you're in Absalom's place, he's exiled himself because there's no telling what might happen to him if he comes back after what he's done and taking revenge and taking justice into his own hands. And so in chapter 14, Absalom is brought back to Jerusalem after 3 years. We'll just kind of quickly summarize what's going on in chapter 14 and how this takes place, but David visits with a wise woman from Tekoa. Joab brings in a wise woman from Tekoa and gives her a story to tell to David. And so Joab kind of sets all of this in motion in chapter 14 to get Absalom brought back. And so he finds a woman who will tell a story, and he has her appear to be in mourning to tell this story about how She's a widow, and one of her sons has killed the other. And now the family has risen up against the one who's the living son and wants to put him to death for what he's done. And she tells this story about how she's upset. She won't have any sons left if this happens. In verse 11 of chapter 14, she said, please let the king remember the Lord your God so that the avenger of blood will not continue to destroy. Otherwise, they'll destroy my son. And he said, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. And so she gets this promise from David. She gets his sympathy. And then in verses 12 and following, she begins to make an association between her situation and David's. And so now the mask begins to come off a little bit. She begins to, so aren't you doing something like this with one of your sons who's been exiled because he's killed one of your other sons? And then you get down to verses 18 to 20, and David realizes what's going on. He said to the woman, don't hide anything from me and what I'm about to ask you. And the woman said, let the Lord my king please speak. So the king said, is the hand of Joab with you in all of this? And David knows his people. He's listened to the story, and then he listens to the comparison made, and he just, it's like he figures out, he said, did Joab put you up to this? He knows exactly what's going on. He knows the personality of his people. In verse 19, he asked that. The woman replied, as your soul lives, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left from anything that my lord the king has spoken. Indeed, it was your servant Joab who commanded me, and it was he who put all these words in the mouth of your maidservant. In order to change the appearance of things, your servant Joab has done this thing. But my Lord is wise, like the wisdom of the angel of God, to know all that's in the earth. And so he recognized the work of Joab when he sees it. But it was successful because in verses 21 and following down to the end of the chapter, David has Absalom brought back to Jerusalem after 3 years in Geshur. But it wasn't exactly a warm reunion. In verse 24, the king said, let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face. So Absalom turned to his own house and did not see the king. And so he says, yeah, you can bring Absalom back, but I don't want to see him. And so he has Absalom brought back out of exile. Okay, yeah, he's not going to suffer harm if he comes back, but you can tell there's still some tension in what's happened. But then in verses 25 to 27, we learn a little bit more about Absalom. He's a little bit full of himself. Verse 25, in all Israel there was no one as handsome as Absalom. So highly praised from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no defect in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, and it was at the end of every year that he cut it, for it was heavy on him, so he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels by the king's weight. To Absalom there were born 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of beautiful appearance. And so Absalom is the most handsome guy in the land, and what you see and what follows, he knows it, and he's acting like it. And so what you see and what follows in this text is he's building up his reputation before everyone. And then verses 28 to 33, Absalom and David finally see each other when Absalom really kind of forces the issue of seeing David. And what he does in this instance is it kind of reveals something of his character because he insists on his rights to see the king. Even after all that's transpired, he's got some sense of entitlement and arrogance. I'm going to go see the king, even after he's murdered one of his brothers. He'd lived in Jerusalem for 2 years without seeing David, and it upset him. So he sends for Joab, and he gets no response. But to get Joab's attention, Absalom, he sends somebody to set Joab's field on fire. And Joab shows up after this, and Absalom demanded to go see David. He bowed down before the king. David kissed his son, and although Absalom has been restored, I can't help but think that there's still some tension in this meeting, because this family is now, for the last 2 years, has been, or 2 or 3 years, has been in turmoil over what's happened. And so Absalom is brought back in, and I guess sort of in the king's good graces. But that won't last for very long, because you get to chapter 15 and Absalom is starting to make some plans. You remember he was this handsome man that everybody looked at and they thought highly of. Well, he's going to start using that to his advantage to try to take a position that isn't his, beginning in chapter 15. Denny?
That's what I was thinking about. David didn't handle this thing very well at all. And so pretty soon the people are not looking at David as a king so much. They're starting to look at someone else, like Absalom. So everything that's taken place here, the people were watching what was going on. And I think at this point they're starting to lose confidence in their king.
Well, that's very possible, and especially based on the way that Absalom plays to that. He begins to undermine the king in what we're going to see in the way that he speaks to the people, and he finds the people specifically that have a grievance. The people who would feel like that they haven't been listened to or paid attention to, and he begins to speak to them. It's people that he could easily pull over to his side. And there are several ways several types of deception that he uses in all of this to try to build himself up. And that's what we get into chapter 15. He conspires against David. And ultimately, David ends up having to flee from Jerusalem. But all of this started because David gave in to temptation. It started this whole where sin is spiraling out of control in his family because of his own action of adultery and murder. And then whenever his own sons got involved in, well, what you see here is sexual assault and murder, you see the same kinds of sin now are coming up in his family, and it just is continuing on. Yeah.
Named his daughter Tamar.
Yes, we see that, as you mentioned there, Absalom named his daughter Tamar. It tells us something of this, even after several years, this is still very fresh on his mind, what has happened and this wrong that was done to Tamar. But Absalom begins to have some ambition for the throne. He's going to take the position of his father David. He's got some ambition for royal recognition. In verse 15, chapter 15, beginning in verse 1, it says, "It came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him." Okay, he's going to make himself look really important. He's going to make sure that his presence is known. He makes himself stand out as a big deal in Jerusalem and in Israel. And in what follows, verses 2 through 5, he begins to play the part of a politician. And so he goes down to the city gate. Does anybody remember at the city gates, what was important about the things that took place at the city gates? Why was that a particularly important spot? Larry?
Well, that was like the city council, the elders. They would sit in front of the gate and make decisions and sign deeds and all that. So that was a very important meeting at the city gates.
The city gate is where business was conducted. That's where you mentioned there, that's where the elders would be found, or at least if they wanted to find a group of some city elders, or if you wanted something important, some kind of a business transaction to happen that needed witnesses, or you go to the city gate. And that's exactly where Absalom goes. He goes to where important things are taking place. He goes down to the city gate. It was a strategic place for Absalom to build himself up in people's eyes. And it says that he was specifically in the habit of intercepting those who had lawsuits. Absalom, verse 2, used to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. And when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servants from one of the tribes of Israel." And Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king." Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land, that every man who has a suit or cause would come to me, and I would give him justice." But when a man came near to prostrate himself before him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. And in this manner Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. And so he's seeking out people who have a lawsuit, people who feel like they've been wronged, they have a claim, there's something that they deserved. That's who Absalom's after. He's going after those that would be easy to pull over to his side. I'll give you justice. David, he doesn't care. But I do. Tell me about your suit. You know, if only he would appoint me to be a judge, if only he would give me this kind of authority, things would be better. Your situation would be better. Everybody would be listened to. If only I could have this position. And so he begins to make himself out to be important and sympathetic to those that had some claim or thought they had some claim. And he makes himself popular among the people. And it says he stole away the hearts of the people. And after some time, verse 7, it came about the end of 40 years that Absalom said to the king, please let me go and pay my vow that I vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I was living in Geshur in Aram, saying, if the Lord shall indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I'll serve the Lord. The king said to him, go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, you shall say, Absalom is king in Hebron. Then 200 men went with Absalom from Jerusalem, who were invited and went innocently, and they did not know anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from the city Gilo, while he was offering the sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. And so he spends some time there in Jerusalem. And after he'd been restored, Absalom requests permission to travel to Hebron to pay a vow. And he sends spies. Instead of doing what he told David he was doing, he sends out spies. But what trick did he pull in order to make himself appear more popular and important than he actually even was? It says in verse 11, 200 men went with him from Jerusalem who were invited, but he didn't tell them what they were invited to. He just invites people. He's building himself up as this important guy. He's got all these runners going with him, and he begins to invite people, and he has 200 more people go with him, but he doesn't tell them this is a conspiracy. I'm about to try to make myself king. He just says, come with me. He didn't tell them. And so he uses deception. He just invited them to go along. And he makes himself look like something special by amassing this big crowd. It makes him appear to have more followers in this conspiracy than he really does. In Hebron, he offers sacrifices and is declared to be the king. And he even has Ahithophel, David's counselor, to go with him. So he's bringing people that would be connected to David, people that have some kind of position, that some kind of a position to be able to do this. But it's also possible, and we'll end with this as far as who's going with him, that Ahithophel may not be too pleased with David anyway. Because while Ahithophel is connected to David, it's not just in being his counselor. Ahithophel is Bathsheba's grandfather. You think about the history there. 2 Samuel 11 verse 3 tells us that Bathsheba is the daughter of Eliam. 2 Samuel 23 and verse 34 tells us that Eliam is the son of Ahithophel. And so he has watched David kind of wreak havoc on his granddaughter's family in what's happened prior to this. And so you see in the way that Absalom is going about this, he's finding people that have high positions, people that would be vulnerable and maybe willing to come over to his side rather than to David's. He invites more people to go along with him. He uses deception to make himself out to be way more important than he is, so that when he declares himself, or he is declared by those that he's asked to be the king, he tries to set it up so that he can be successful. And we'll stop there in verse 13. We'll pick up next week where it works so well that David ends up having to flee Jerusalem. And so we'll pick up there and we continue in what we're going to see and what follows, more of the consequences, more of the fallout from David's sin. It all started because he gave in to temptation. Are there any other comments or questions before we conclude? If not, let's finish with the word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we love you so much, and we thank you for the time that we've gotten to spend in your word, Father. And as we look at a part of your word that highlights the ugly effects of sin, Father, I pray that that as we know all of us are tempted sometimes, Father, I pray that this would give us motivation to think through our actions, to think through the consequence of it, Father, and to realize that sin is never worth the price. Father, I pray that the result this morning of our discussion in your word would be that we would all walk more closely in the steps of Jesus and strive to draw nearer to you. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.